when you open the door for somebody else.
Welcome back to the Vaccine Conversation. It's good to have you joining us this afternoon or this morning or tonight or whatever.
It's good to have you pronouncing the podcast correctly.
Yeah, this is take two.
This is take
by
two.
The way.
Dr. Bob introduced you all to the Vaccine Podcast. But this is actually called the Vaccine Conversation, though it really is a podcast about vaccines. It's all just in the details, isn't it?
Yep. Well, today we're talking about the flu, it being flu season and all. We kind of felt an obligation to not just do one podcast on the flu, but two.
Wait, doesn't flu season seem to begin earlier and earlier every year? I feel like before it used to be November, December. Now it's like all the end of September. They're already starting to warn.
Yeah, this year's flu shots came out early. They came out in I don't know if it was August or September. I mean, some years we've waited until November. They came out late, but yeah.
I feel like that was in direct response to our more numerous flu season of last year and how more people are, quote unquote, afraid of that again. And so it's a little easier maybe to put the flu vaccines out earlier because people are going, oh my gosh, last year was pretty bad. So I'll go ahead and get that now.
Well, last year's peak, it peaked in like February and March, I'm pretty sure. It's either January and February or February and March. We rarely see it hit really hard in October and November. Don't panic. I mean, it's out there.
No, if you listen to the media, do panic.
Okay, yes.
You are supposed to panic. They have paid millions of dollars to make sure you do exactly what you just told everybody not to, which is to panic.
Yes.
Because panic incites action. And when you feel afraid, you take steps to feel more secure. And according to the media, the only thing you can do to feel better about the upcoming or super extra long flu season, because now they're going to say it goes all the way until April. The only thing you can do to feel more secure is going to be what?
Eat your fruits and vegetables.
Yes, and get more rest.
Exercise.
Higher vitamin D levels.
Yes, go outside a lot.
Maybe some vitamin C in higher dosages.
Right.
If you feel like you're coming down with something.
I mean, they make what? Probably 200 million doses of vitamin C every year, and they put it out every fall.
And it's very lucrative.
Right.
No, but of course we're joking here because the thing that they tell you to do is not what we just mentioned, which are all the things that boost your immune system to keep you healthier and not just sick with the flu, but not sick with all the other stuff going around, like respiratory illness and other things that are going around. But no, what they tell you is the only answer to this predicament that we are in, which is flu season, is to get a flu vaccine. That's it. That's what you need to do. If you don't do that, you're going to be a fatality statistic according to what you see on the news, right? It's very dim. Your future looks very dim if you do not get your flu vaccine.
Exactly. And how dim does it look? Well,
tell us, Bob.
Yeah. I mean, let's. I guess we like to have fun. We're trying to make a really boring topic more fun, so we're going to laugh sometimes. But I know when we're talking about disease fatality, I mean it's every single one of those is tragic. So we don't mean to make light of that. I think we're just trying to again make this a more interesting conversation for you. Last year, the CDC estimates there were 80,000 deaths from the flu. Last year was a really bad season, and 80,000 Americans.
This was just reported from an interview with the Associated Press that the representative said that, yes, this is the blind estimation of how many there were. With
80,000 deaths. And now what the CDC usually says.
Huge, though. That's a huge number.
80,000 people dying of any infectious disease, in America should really raise your eyebrows. But let's talk about CDC estimates, because I think it's important to understand how those are gathered and how they make those judgments. And what you usually hear, the most common statistic is 36,000 Americans die every year of the flu. They've said that every single year, 36,000. And you would assume that means that the CDC basically looked at all the death certificates, nationwide of everyone who died in the country, and they find that 36,000 people have flu written on their death certificate as the cause of death. And that's actually not at all the case. That is not how the CDC comes up with these numbers. There is an organization that does investigate death certificates and looks at cause of death as the reason why you died from something, and it's called the National Center for Health Statistics, and they look at all kinds of causes of death. Their data show that only between 1,000 and 1,500 people in America die every year of the flu. Between 1,000 and 1,500 have flu on as their cause of death, as their main cause of death. What the CDC does, though, is they describe this on their website. You can go to their website and look at how they come up with these numbers. They use a lot of fancy math. They use a lot of estimates. And then they actually look at everyone who dies of the flu and of pneumonia, both flu and pneumonia. They take those two statistics and put them together. And then they put all these mathematical models together to try to decide how many of those people who died from pneumonia really died of the flu. And then they come up with this 36,000 Americans every year, and then last year they come up with 80,000. But I guess you have to realize that where that number comes from, it's not a solid number. The only solid number we really have, based on real data, is 1,000, usually 1,000 deaths every year. And if I could break that down briefly, you'll see basically the media headlines: 36,000 Americans die every year. Most of them infants and the elderly. Right. So if you hear 36,000 people died and most of them were infants, right, and the elderly, you're going to think tens of thousands of babies died of the flu and tens of thousands of elderly died.
And this is super risky.
Right.
And this
it's
is
really
I've got to
dangerous.
go get my baby vaccinated, which is encouraged according to the CDC schedule at 6 months,
Right.
and then again a second dose at 7 months
Right.
to create enough a boost of an immunity, let's say, to
Right.
create an antibody response. So
Right.
a typical child that is following the CDC schedule is going to be advised by their pediatrician to get their 6-month-old baby vaccinated with the flu vaccine at 6 months and again at 7 months.
Right, or 9 and 10 months if it's your first flu season, or if it's your first flu season and you're 15 months old because when you were 3 months you were too young to get the flu shot. You'll get 2 doses that very first flu season that your baby encounters, 6 months and older, but every year after that, every year moving forward. But some of the numbers is it's not tens of thousands of babies dying of the flu every year. Again, every death is tragic, but when you actually look at actual solid data and how many babies do pass away of the flu, we have about 20 infants die of the flu every year in our country. We have about 20 toddlers. We have about 20 elementary age kids. We have about 20 teenagers, and we have about 20 young adults. Kind of each of those age groups, there's about 20 tragic fatalities from the flu, and there's roughly about 1,000, sometimes about 1,300 elderly who die of the flu every year. And again, those are the real numbers. That's the best data that anyone's ever been able to come up with from the National Center for Health Statistics. And because I just want to.
Well, so in this article too, it says, and I'm sorry, I'm looking for my other. I had all my mortality statistic stuff out.
Okay.
Don't
you hate it when there's a table leg right in front of your?
I have like my entire packet that I went through, and somehow that's still on my desk where I was reviewing it. So sorry.
See, all my data are just like up here.
Yeah.
You know,
I was looking specifically at graphs, but we'll
Right.
maybe get to that and give you the gist. But in this article, it says that last flu season, according to because they do surveillance for pediatric deaths, like you're saying, they don't do surveillance for adults for that reason, like you mentioned. So it's really hard to estimate. So there were 183 children that died. Which again is awful, but
usually 100 or so.
Yeah, so 183, and this was a really
183.
strong season, a super strong season. A lot more people were sick than usual, and 183 deaths. If they say most are in children and elderly, you would assume that maybe children are 30 to 40% and elderly are 60 to 70%.
Right.
So with this 80,000 estimate, then we're looking at a lot more children that would have been confirmed with a death. So if you want to maybe hypothesize, let's say 183 children being a 30% rate, then we're looking at maybe 610. I put this here about 610 adults that might have died. Which you put those two together, and you're still under 1,000, which is very different than 80,000.
Right, exactly.
And it's important that people understand that, yes, this is an estimate, and even the 36,000 is an estimate that's inaccurate every other year. But why do you think they would put an estimate out that is so inaccurate and so grossly overstated? What do you think? We know, but what's the reason behind that?
Right. Well, actually, that's part 2 of our podcast, right?
I mean, and give them a teaser. Right. I mean, what's behind it.
It's the media fear. And we'll actually talk about how the organizations who make the flu vaccine and how they do work with the Centers for Disease Control to promote the flu vaccine and to spread the fear about the flu, so that everyone will line up for their flu shots like good little people. And because if you tell people, how really not say. No, how do you say undangerous? I mean, how mild the flu really is for most people, benign. And what the danger really is, how it's a benign illness for most people.
For healthy individuals,
right.
Yeah.
Fewer people are going to line up for their flu shots.
Again, I mean, 180 is a far cry from 30,000. If you were assuming that 30,000 of the 80,000 were children, 30,000 sounds like a lot because it is a lot. But 180 for a very strong season, when the average, like you're saying, is about 100, is not a huge increase. And the article goes on to say, it says what this is a clear message about the importance of vaccination. They're saying all these deaths. What this tells you is it's super important to get vaccinated. And then she says, the vaccine is safe. Blatant statement. Right. This is Dr. CBS News medical contributor, Dr. Tara Narula, says this vaccine is safe. It is the most effective tool we have, and we know it's not that effective, right? And she said that what they continue to say in here is it's even if the vaccine isn't working that well, it's still important you go get vaccinated. Right. And I find that sentence to be so interesting. When I hear somebody tell me, this is totally not working, but go get your vaccine, right. It's important that you do it. We want to make sure you understand getting vaccinated is the most important thing you can do. It's like, why would you do that with something that doesn't work?
And if it was 100% harmless, maybe that wouldn't be a bad idea.
Yeah,
but that's where you have to weigh the risk versus the benefit. And I want to throw out real quick, don't just take my word for it on this the statistic from the National Center for Health Statistics about that only about 1,000 people truly die from the flu every year. I just want to refer you to the Cochrane group. It's the Cochrane community. They have a community blog. They're a consortium of scientists all over the world. They're called the Cochrane Database of Systematic Reviews. But they actually have a blog, and if you can Google search it. It's called "Why Have 3 Long-Running Cochrane Reviews on Influenza Vaccines Been Stabilized?" And towards the end of our article, they actually confirm. And I just want to read this because they put it better than me. I probably should have read theirs instead of saying it myself. They say, towards the end, the standard quoted figure of 36,000 yearly deaths in the U.S. is based on the respiratory and circulatory deaths category, including all types of pneumonia, including secondary to meconium ingestion or bacterial causes. A lot of that is in newborns, bacterial pneumonias. They actually say when actual death certificates are tallied, influenza deaths on average are a little more than 1,000 yearly. And that's from an organization like the Cochrane group. There's some controversy in the Cochrane group lately, but they've for many decades they've been very objective. They're outside financial influences for the most part. They're not funded by pharma.
As an independent,
right?
Yeah.
They're very independent. And that's the number they come up with as well as myself.
Also, Dr. Brownstein, I don't know if you're familiar with him, on his holistic medicine blog, he also talks about this 80,000. He says more fake news from the CDC. And he says that because in 2001, the CDC reported 62,000 deaths from influenza and pneumonia. And that was in 2001. And the actual number was 257. So 257 flu deaths. And the estimate was 62,000.
Right.
So you can, if you had to kind of use those and correlate them to this year, we're under 1,000 at deaths for a super strong season, which means people are fighting this off better than they think. This is not catching, 1 in 5 people on your street, and you're a goner if you happen to catch this.
Right. And in fact, we're gonna talk more data from the Cochrane group about what the actual scientifically studied effectiveness of the vaccine is. And we're going to get to that.
And there are some conflicts of interest, which we'll also talk about too, because that's part of, they say the CDC holds the patent for several flu vaccines. Saying that you encouraging to get somebody, I think, so I would say the flu vaccine is probably the one that has the most public doubt, wouldn't you say? Like most people think to themselves, if I'm going to opt out of something, I'll opt out of this one because it doesn't work that well. I know a lot of people get sick. I've heard of a lot of severe reactions. This is the one I'd say that has the least amount of public confidence, with HPV coming second, I'd say.
So that's part why there's such a push.
Exactly.
Because if you think about this, there are about 350 million Americans in our country. 350 million. They actually make about 150 million flu doses. I think sometimes they even try to make 200 million. They're trying to make a flu dose for every single American almost, right? Because actually every single American is supposed to get a flu shot. It's actually now indicated for every single person unless you're less than 6 months of age. So if
is for the healthy people of 2020, right?
If every single of those 350 Americans, if they're all vying for those 200 million doses, did I say million? Yeah, 200 million doses. Think of it. Vaccine companies make 200 million doses every year. They only have 9 months to sell them. Mm-hmm. And everything they don't sell, they have to throw out. It's very different than most other vaccines. If you're making MMR vaccine, you're going to need about 4 million of those doses every year, because that's how many children are born. You know exactly how many to make, and almost everyone gets them. Almost everyone gets all the childhood vaccines. But because a lot of people don't get the flu shots, and they put so many billions of dollars into making them, the clock is ticking, and that's why the unique push on this one vaccine. It's advertised more than any other vaccine because if they can't sell, if they have to throw away 50 million of those doses at the end of the year, and then they lose making about $10 a dose, that's $500 million that they're pouring down the drain as toxic waste if it has mercury in it. And they don't want to be left holding as much, and that's why they incorporate the whole medical machine to sell the flu shot, whereas you don't see that kind of push with most other shots.
And I will say, so in this article that talked about the 80,000, it says that there are a lot of parents that have misconceptions about the safety and the importance of vaccines. And so whatever survey they're citing here says, and I feel like this is all, I'm prefacing this by saying this is all in an effort to paint parents who question things as uneducated and illogical. So they said 30% of parents feel flu vaccines are a conspiracy. That was actually like the reason. They're just the shot, the vaccine is a conspiracy. And then the other thing was 28% believe flu vaccines can cause autism. Just the flu vaccine is going to instantly, and then more than half think their child's going to actually get full-on influenza from the flu shot. And right down below that, the doctor weighs in. None of these things are true, she says. It's important that we deal with science and the facts, as in all of the above the things that people question, all of the parents who question, all of the people who say maybe this isn't the best thing. You're not listening to science, you're not listening to facts, and you are basically ridiculous. Like in the end of it, you are ridiculous. And it says the CDC recommends everyone over 6 months gets vaccinated every single year. And she says it's a no-brainer for parents. It's a no-brainer. Just get the flu vaccine, right? Even though we know it is not that effective, and you said we'll talk about that. Even though we know it is not that safe for some people, and it's not working, but get it anyway. And because people don't really have that confidence, they are forced to advertise this, like you said, and we'll talk about that. Do you want to just briefly mention? You mentioned mercury. Do you want to just briefly talk about the difference between thimerosal free and the original version, and why there's mercury in the standard version.
Right. So they
people say there's no more mercury in vaccines.
Right. So they had mercury in about half of our childhood vaccines in the 80s and 90s, and they took it out of most of the vaccines by 2002, except the flu shots. They kept putting mercury as a preservative in the flu shots, and they still do today. About half of the shots they make now have mercury, and about half of them are mercury free, or thimerosal is the term they use because it sounds safer than mercury. The large 10-dose bottles that are less expensive to buy, less expensive to
multi-vial.
use. Yeah, multi-dose vials. Those are the ones that have mercury. The ones that come in individually packaged syringes or vials, where only one person is getting a dose out of that.
Are more expensive.
They're more expensive, a little bit, just a little bit. Those are the mercury-free ones. So I think, even though we're not saying whether you should or shouldn't get a flu shot, I think one thing we can advocate for is if you're going to get a flu shot, make sure you're getting one without mercury.
Because explain in a multi-dose vial, explain how levels of mercury, the thimerosal, can settle at the bottom. And so if you're one of those last doses, you could be getting a much higher level than what's estimated to be safe. And that can cause, obviously serious problems and is dangerous.
Right.
And that's a risk you take every single time you would have a flu vaccine that is not individually given, which is thimerosal free.
Right. Can I touch a little bit on, just a very brief history lesson, because I find it kind of fascinating. I have to take my glasses off. Sorry. To read this.
They can't see you. This is not a video podcast.
I was explaining to Melissa.
Which I'm so glad about, by the way. I'm so glad this is not video.
Okay, I'm going to put my feet up on this chair now and relax while I read this.
Because we're just hanging out with you guys in your living room or car or whatever. We're just talking about this.
So basically, this comes from a British medical journal piece from 2013. And the flu shot came out in the 1960s. It was only for adults over 65. And then in 84, they added healthcare workers. In 87, they added household contacts of high-risk groups.
But wait, for healthcare workers, it wasn't mandatory.
Not mandatory, just suggested. Right. In 2000, they added all adults over 50. All right. And they added pregnant women in the second and third trimester. The pregnant women recommendation came in the year 2000.
And we're going to do another episode completely on pregnancy and vaccines.
Exactly, right. And then in 2004, now, so it's scary that pregnant woman recommendation came while there was still mercury. This is the year 2000.
This is before they had thimerosal free.
Right. Then 2004, they added children, 6 to 23 months. And they added household contacts of children.
And this is still before thimerosal free.
No, now they're making thimerosal free versions, but they're not.
But not everybody's not getting them. I mean, would people even know? I know people right now that go to get their flu vaccine. They don't even know there's a thimerosal free. They just go and say, "I want a flu vaccine."
I'm talking history now. We already talked about mercury, right?
Right, but I'm saying, like, for people to not even understand. So at the time that when they started offering them, it's not like people might have even been getting them because they didn't even know they were offered. This is not something that has been made public knowledge like at that time.
Right. And we're going to talk about all kinds of interesting stuff with California law and mercury and vaccines. So in 2006, they added older children. So it came infants first in 2004. Then 2006, older children are added to the flu vaccine schedule and their household contacts. 2008, they added children up to 18 years. Started recommending it for all kids. And then in 2010, they added basically everyone, every single person on the planet, 6 months and older. That flu recommendation came on in 2010. And so I just kind of found it interesting how they expanded the population base.
Slowly,
slowly, and
so they started with the elderly,
without having the data to show that it's working very well, that it's protecting these populations,
or it's necessary,
or that it's safe,
Well, so they start with the elderly, and then they go to the kids, and they work the kids on the way up in age groups. And what I find so interesting about that is it seems a little easier to sell the narrative of needing the flu vaccine to your children because you don't want your children to die, right? When the fear is pushing, your children are at risk of dying. Most parents who they themselves might not get the vaccine might get it for their child because of the fear that this is a child I have to protect and save this child. And this is, again, a perceived notion of fear that it was not translating into numbers of actual deaths. But it seems a lot easier to sell people, just like this, 277, to sell people on the idea of mandating children's vaccines is a lot easier than to create legislation to mandate adult vaccines. And most people would say, oh no, I would not be comfortable being forced to get X number of doses to work. But they're okay with them being mandated for school, right? So it seems like the direction that they went, they started with the elderly because that was obvious. Then they go with children, they work their way up, and they work their way up to eventually get to adults. Adults seem to be the last group of people that would feel comfortable being forced or mandated to get the flu vaccine. So that your historical perspective on it actually verifies what I'm saying. You start with kids first, and we know that mandatory adult vaccinations are in the works for 2020, right? That is the goal, the healthy people, 2020. The idea is to have all adults up to date, which would mean a lot of vaccines for every single adult, including the flu vaccine.
Right.
And I think most people would not be comfortable with that. Most people would not be okay with. Yeah. And right now it's about 45%, I think, of the population that gets the flu vaccine, compared to like 8%, by the way, in the 1989. And I wish I had all my stuff. We might have to cover this again in another thing, but it was, like 8% of people were getting the flu vaccine in 1989. And it's jumped up to 45%, which is so significant because when you're talking about money, and it was 23 million doses back then, and now it's 150 million doses.
Right.
And you talk about people don't realize what that translates to financially. That is a huge, huge number. We're talking about hundreds upon millions of dollars.
Right.
And so there is incentive there for there to be a push that's not necessarily based on keeping you safe or keeping your child safe. There might be more to it.
Yeah, so let me go back, go into some more boring medical research. Again, in my opinion, the best flu data come from the Cochrane database of systematic reviews, and this is actually from February 2018. This is from this year. It's called "Vaccines for Preventing Influenza in the Elderly," and it was let's see, I don't know, where was it published? Oh, it's published in the Cochrane Library of Database of Systematic Reviews. So if you Google search that, you can find this. It's very fascinating. And Cochrane makes the point that there are very, very few studies that actually systematically and properly test how well the flu vaccine works. Most of the studies are just like observational studies, retrospective, where they look in the past to see how well it works. Very few are what's called randomized controlled trials. And that's really the gold standard of determining how something works, called a randomized controlled trial. And so what they came up with, they did 3 articles. One is how well does it work in the elderly, how well does it work in healthy adults, and how well does it work in children. And so I just want to give you the numbers. I'm not going to read you the whole thing. Unless you do want to take a nap, Melissa. Tell us. So basically, conclusions: older adults receiving the influenza vaccine may have a lower risk of influenza. It changes your risk from catching it from about 6% to 3%. So if you don't get the vaccine, you have about a 6% chance of catching influenza. If you get the vaccine, you have about a 3% chance.
But don't they make it seem like 100% of people are catching it? You either catch it and survive it, or you catch it and die from it.
You're right, because that's a very interesting point. They found that those who did not get the vaccine, 6% of them caught the flu. That means 94% of adults did not catch the flu.
I mean, I'm surprised by that number. Even I have been made to believe that like pretty much 70-80% of the population is catching the flu at any given time. But really, 6%?
Right. Yeah, they're saying it for older adults. Yeah, for the elderly.
But they're even more risky. They're more at risk, aren't they? More susceptible, technically?
They are. But they say when they look at all the research, they say the available evidence relating to complications of the flu, or whether or not the flu shot prevents complications in the elderly. Those data are of poor quality. There's no clear guidance for public health regarding the safety, efficacy, or effectiveness of influenza vaccines for people age 65 and older. So they're basically saying, yeah, the best data we have show it's going to lower your risk from about 6% to 3%
of catching it.
Yeah, of catching it for the elderly, but we don't know if it's going to prevent complications. We don't know if it's going to make you safer or healthier. We don't know enough about the safety of the vaccine.
Right,
in the
I was
elderly.
going to say because you might get the vaccine to prevent the flu, and it could cause something else from the vaccine itself.
Right. So when you look at the possible side effects of the flu, especially something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is
You're talking about the flu or flu vaccine?
Yeah, the flu vaccine. Yeah, a risk of the flu vaccine called Guillain-Barré, which is a temporary paralysis. It is not rare. I've talked to so many people, and you look at so many research articles that show Guillain-Barré after the flu. You have to decide if getting temporary paralysis from the flu vaccine or any of the other host of side effects, including allergic reactions, severe allergic reactions. You have to decide if that risk is worth you taking your risk from 6% down to 3% of
with
catching
no
the
proof
flu.
Of preventing complications of the flu if you were to get it.
So that's the elderly. Let's go to the healthy adults. They come with similar numbers. Basically, getting the flu vaccine in a healthy adult reduced influenza from 2% to 1%.
Only 2% of adults are getting it?
They say 2.3% to 1% was rounded off to 2. It reduced your chance from 2.3 to 1.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Based on the data of all the studies that they
based on
put
their
together.
data, I just want to confirm this.
Well, no, they're not doing the research. They are looking at everybody's research that have actually done randomized controlled trials.
Right, but out of all the body of work that they've seen that had to do with this, they are saying that only 2% of healthy adults would have a risk of getting influenza every season.
Right.
Are you kidding me?
Right, but if you think about it, I mean, you could probably admit that there are like asymptomatic adults or people that barely feel sick, people who have great nutrition, who exercise, they eat healthy, they're happy, they're not stressed, they have great immune systems. They're catching the flu. They probably barely feel it.
And so you're saying, they wouldn't be reporting this to have a body of data. But still, 2% is teeny. Right. I mean, they really make it seem like, here comes the season, get ready.
Yeah. The other thing you have to realize, and I think the one reason why we all have the impression why the flu is so incredibly common is the vast majority of cases of the flu, in quotes, are actually not really the flu virus. It's called a influenza-like illness. It means you feel like you have the flu, you feel sick like you have the flu, you might go to the doctor thinking you have the flu, but when they actually test you, you don't test positive for the flu. You have a variety of other viruses that mimic the flu. And they actually did some research that showed about 85% of test samples when people went to doctors thinking they had the flu and they were tested for it, 85% of the samples are negative for the flu. Only about 15% of people who go to the doctor thinking they have the flu actually do have the flu. So I think that's why the perception of that the flu is everywhere is one thing, but the reality in that the actual real numbers is actually pretty low when it comes to the specific flu virus. I don't know. So I'm just reading the data.
I know, but I mean, that's really interesting.
It sounds low, but another way to look at it is even if it is low, the benefit of the vaccine takes you from 2% of the people catching the flu down to 1% of the people catching the flu. All right.
But you could say is half. That seems like it's might be significant, but when you're talking at 2%, 1%, those are teeny numbers. Yeah. But I bet if you wanted to portray this a certain way, you could take that study and say you are twice as likely to get the flu if you don't have the vaccine because of 1% to 2%.
But I didn't finish reading it. That was just the first number. So they looked at hospitalizations and they looked at days off work. The vaccine actually did not help. The vaccine did not lower your risk as a healthy adult of being hospitalized, and it did not lower your risk of missing work.
And I've seen that a lot. Like there's a huge group of people that say, oh, the importance of a vaccine is going to be to save money for companies, and people lost days of work and lost days of having your child having to stay home, so you have to miss work to take care of them. You do see that come out, the financial burden, if you will, of having the flu.
But when you look at the randomized controlled trials, the real good research studies, they don't find that benefit. Then now this is again in the healthy adult category. They did a study on pregnant women, and I'll just touch on this briefly. They only found one study that was valid in pregnant women. One randomized controlled trial. All the other trials on pregnant women were just observational studies or studies done after the fact. They didn't randomly put people into a controlled trial. They found that pregnant women, it reduced your chance of catching the flu by about 50%. And if you were a pregnant woman, you got the shot, it reduced your newborn's chance of getting the flu by about 50%. All right.
And what was the percent overall that they were catching?
They don't show. They don't actually have those numbers here. They do say later on when they look at the pregnancy numbers and the newborn numbers, the benefit seen in pregnant and newborn babies was smaller than the benefits seen in general healthy adults. Those percentage reductions from the flu shot were actually smaller reductions than what adults really get. If you're a scientist, you probably like reading all the Cochrane stuff. You can read these. Again, vaccines for preventing influenza in the elderly, vaccines for preventing influenza in healthy adults, February 2018, the Cochrane Database of Systematic Reviews. Just throwing these numbers. And let me just end here with the children. Here's where you see more numbers of flu in kids. Mm-hmm. They say the flu shot reduced the chance of catching the flu in children from 30% if you're not vaccinated down to 10% if you were vaccinated. All right. So if you were a vaccinated child, you had about a 10% chance of catching the flu. If you're not vaccinated, you had a 30% chance. Those are the numbers they come up when they look at all the well-done trials. For children, but that's kids just from 2 to 16. Mm-hmm. There were very few randomized controlled trials in children under age 2. They couldn't find any data that showed any benefit in kids under 2. And that's where the first recommendation came from. They first recommended kids 6 months to 2 years with no data on how well it worked. And then they added the older kids later.
I just think numbers are so interesting because if you take the 6% to 3% for the elderly, like I said before, you can have people saying you are twice as likely to catch the flu if you don't vaccinate. And that sounds like a big number, but you don't realize it's 3% to 6%, but it sounds a lot bigger. And if you look at healthy people, you could say, you're twice as likely, even though it's 1% to 2%, which is teeny. Right. And then for infants, you would say, over 65% more likely to catch it if you don't get the vaccine. So it's important people understand when you see quoted percentages and these big, huge estimations like 80,000 and deaths, a lot of this stuff is not based on actual numbers. And it is important to find actual data, which is something you can totally find yourself on the CDC website. They have mortality statistics. Let me throw out a couple things. In a nutshell, I think a lot of people say, don't get the flu shot, it doesn't work. It's worthless, it doesn't do anything. My thought when I look at all these data is that it very well might actually reduce your risk of catching the flu and feeling sick from it. I think it might. I think it's hard to argue that there's no research that shows it does. It doesn't do anything. It's 100% worthless. I don't think you can really support that. I think a lot of people probably have that impression as worthless. But when you compare it to vaccines that supposedly say are 95% effective or 98% effective, even 80% effective, the flu vaccine is so much lower than that, that you are very likely to catch the flu regardless of what you do. The flu might lower your risk of catching it. We do know the flu shot does not prevent the spread of disease from person to person. So getting a flu shot, if you get a flu shot that has no bearing on me, you're not going to
it's not going to stop you from catching the germs and having them get in your system and you spreading those germs to me. You're just not going to feel as sick.
Which is those asymptomatic carriers.
Right. But it doesn't affect me. So mandatory flu vaccine policies make no sense. All they do is they might help that individual feel less sick. They're still going to come to work. They're still going to spread the flu to other people because the shot doesn't stop you from spreading it. So let me try to explain what exactly it means when you hear the flu vaccine is 20% effective. At the highest it's ever been really is 60% effective. Sometimes it's as low as 10% effective. But let's say, for example, 5 people out of 100 people are going to catch the flu this year. 5 out of 100. I'm just making up that number. The elderly research we showed said about 6% of the elderly catch the flu. The adult research we showed, like healthy adults, showed about 2% will catch the flu. But let's just use 5 for an easy number. If you have a flu vaccine that's 20% effective in 1 year, that means instead of 5 people out of 100 catching the flu, 4 people out of 100 will catch the flu that year. If you have a flu vaccine that's 50% effective, or let's say 60%, the highest ever, 60% effective, that means only 2 people out of 100 will catch the flu instead of the usual 5 people out of 100. And these would be all in vaccinated people. So let's say 100 people get the flu vaccine, and it's it's a high effectiveness year, 60% effective. That means out of those 100 people all getting vaccinated, say the flu tries to infect 5 of those people. 3 of those people won't feel sick from the flu because the vaccine has been 60% effective in those 5 people. 2 people will still feel sick from the flu and maybe go to the doctor, and 3 will not feel sick from the flu. Hopefully I'm making sense. It makes sense to me, but so that's kind of what those effectiveness numbers mean kind of in real life. I think that the bottom line is the flu numbers are pretty low as far as how many people are seriously harmed, how many people are affected, how many people actually feel sick enough to see a doctor. And so for me, it kind of comes down to it's not going to be worthless to you. It might help a little bit, but you have to weigh the risks. You have to weigh the risk of side effects. You really should read the package inserts, the risk of side effects, look at all the risk of the flu vaccine.
For adults, on the VAERS report, at least, it's the highest rated for vaccines, adverse events.
In fact, I forgot we had that here. And that's where you talk about risk. And sorry, I totally confused myself on all those numbers. But when you look at the fact that about 1,000 people seem to die of the flu every year, all right, most of them elderly, a very small number of children, and very few of them are healthy adults. That's deaths from the flu every year. When you look at deaths from the flu vaccine that have been reported, over the last maybe about 25, 30 years, there have been 1,500 deaths from the flu vaccine reported. There have been 12,000 people hospitalized for flu vaccine reactions, hospitalized. Not just go to the ER, but hospitalized. And there have been 3,000 people disabled from the flu vaccine from a nerve injury.
And now, can that be permanent, or is it always temporary?
No, it can be permanent.
Yeah, it's important to note.
So you look at 12,000 hospitalizations, 3,000 disabilities, 1,500 deaths from flu vaccine alone. And then you look at yourself as a healthy child or a healthy adult, and your risk of dying from the flu is so tiny, so very small. You really have to understand those risks and weigh whether or not you think the flu vaccine is right for you that year, given its low efficacy, 20% sometimes.
Well, and these new studies are showing that you're having the flu vaccine 1 year makes you the next year when you get the flu vaccine, it work even less because you've had it multiple years. And then we can talk about that in another episode. But that's something to think about too, is sometimes your immunity levels are not going to be as efficient on a subsequent year. According to new research, it shows that you actually reduce your chances. If you've had it multiple years in a row, you're actually reducing your chances regardless of what the CDC says is the rate of efficacy for that year. That's not going to apply to you because your body, after having one the year before, is going to reduce it. And that was an interesting study that came out recently too.
Yeah. So boy, that really fried my brain. trying to go through all of those flu studies. But
there are a lot of numbers too, and I think it can be a lot to digest for somebody listening to this or somebody sitting next to you while you're doing this.
I know Melissa's like nodding off. Oh my gosh,
it's just so I love reviews. I love data. I love information. I like the fact that there is plenty of stuff to back up what we're talking about. This is not. These are not just like, it's not blind information. This is based on facts. I just think it's sort of hard to maybe put it into perspective. But summarizing basically what you said, one, I'm super surprised that the numbers, your likelihood of catching influenza is much lower, according to what this data suggests, much lower than I anticipated. I mean, 6% for the elderly, 2% for healthy adults, and then 30% for children, much lower than I thought. And then to show that it's reducing that risk by a small amount. It's not guaranteeing you protection. And then, like we know, there definitely are issues with safety when it comes to the flu vaccine specifically. And we know a lot of that has to do with ingredients, and which we're going to spend probably, I'd say, 2 episodes on just ingredients, because it's important to break down each of these things and how risky or not risky each of these ingredients are, because we hear about ingredients a lot. But we do know that the flu in the media is portrayed a certain way. And so we'll go into another episode on why it's portrayed that way, how advertising comes into it, who is behind the push, why is public confidence so low, and I'm gonna have a snack and drink some coffee, see if I can boost my brain back up for part 2. Well, part 2 doesn't have any numbers, so that's the good news. I mean, numbers are good. I just want people that are listening to heard all these different percentages and your special demonstration of 20% and 80%. I just want people to understand.
Should we cut that out, or should we just leave it in there just because it's so hilarious?
I just want you guys to understand that yes, numbers are important, and if you need more information on this, we do have a flu video on immunityeducationgroup.com that you can check out. We have information
.org.
there. Oh, sorry, .org.
Yeah.
Isn't that .com too? I think it's both.
We might have .com too,
Anyway, we have a flu vaccine that's like a little piece if you're a visual learner and just want to have kind of an overview. And I know this situation, this question comes up a lot about whether or not to get the flu vaccine, or I heard my coworker talking about it, or just how dangerous is it? Does it even work? And so we're hoping to kind of, address some of those things that you've been wondering about and that you hear a lot about. And I just, again, want people to understand that the media representation about the risk of the flu and exactly how much the flu vaccine helps, is skewed. And we know that it's not necessarily working that well, and we know that the risk is not as high as it's portrayed. Right. And the most important thing is staying healthy, having a strong immune system. That does not necessarily mean the vaccine is going to, like you said, people assume it's just worthless. But on the other side, people also assume this is like the oracle. This is like, if I just have this magical shot, it's going to keep me from getting anything and I'll be protected. And we know that's not always the case. A lot of people that do get the vaccine do get sick. We know the strains don't always match. And it's just worth checking out both sides of it, always.
Right. Well, tune into part 2 of the flu episode and
the flu debate.
It's
not the flu, because we're going to have another episode just about influenza, the disease, the vaccine, everything. Okay. This is more like the social, political, and news-worthy topics as it relates to the flu right now.
Okay. Well, we'll see you guys. In fact, we might see you right now, because you might go and just listen to that episode right now.
Because you're so excited that you're like, when can I get to flu part 2?
Well, let's listen to a bit of music first, and then we'll see you on the flip side.
Bye.
We're gonna be the peace we wanna see in the world. Yeah, be the peace we wanna see in the world. Yeah, be the love we wanna see in the world. Be the joy we wanna see in the world. Be the change, see in the world.
The information in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice. Always consult your healthcare professional for information on vaccines and infectious diseases.